know that high quality care really can be a make or break point for children's optimal development. And within quality, the single most important factor is the teacher. Now, what you may not know is that within the next 10 years, within the state of Colorado, we are facing a real bind with this workforce. So we are expecting more than a 22% increase in children birth to age 5 in the state in about the next 8 years. And within about the same amount of time, a 33 to 43% increase in the need for the early childhood workforce. At the same time, you'll hear about turnover rates. You'll hear about lack of staff overall in various parts of the state. And you'll come to understand why very consistently when businesses seek to hire in parts of the state, they often indicate that one of the top 3 problems in expanding is that there is not an appropriate supply of quality child care and workforce for families that could be hired. So we're going to hear more about that. We have 2 great researchers that will talk about the latest findings from both an economic sector analysis of the workforce as well as a survey of the early childhood workforce itself. And then a great respondent panel, which I will introduce later on. And this is not, oh, this is just sort of cycling through. Okay, I bet you've been ignoring these slides all along, just like me. So we won't even worry about that. So without further ado, I'd like to, I'd like to introduce Paul Teske. He'll talk later. Take your time. I would like to introduce Dr. Meg Franco, who is the Director of Research and Evaluation at the Butler Institute for Families in the Graduate School of Social Work at University of Denver. And then she will be followed by Dr. Diana Schack, who is the Assistant Research Professor here at CU Denver in the School of Education and Human Development.
Thank you, Jennifer, and hello. It's so great to see everybody, especially it's so rainy today and the traffic was horrible if you had to come down Spear Boulevard. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I am one of the researchers who worked on the economic analysis. I did this with Andrew Brodsky, who's a wonderful economist who's done other work like this in early childhood. And with some of our research staff at the Butler Institute for Families. And also just want to acknowledge, early milestones, Department of Education, Department of Human Services, Piton Foundation, Gary Community Investments, and the Buell Foundation for supporting this. So as Jennifer mentioned, we pulled together this study in response to this crisis that they were the partners that I just mentioned have been seeing, and they really wanted to know more about, dig in deeper about what was really happening. So the goals of our study were what you see up here, really to describe the role of the early care and education sector in Colorado's economy, and explore the cost, how much does it cost to run a business in this industry, and explain the implications for low wages and turnover, and then identify the extent to which the market is working appropriately. So for this study, our methodology really relied on a lot of secondary data analysis. So a lot of federal data and data from the states and cost modeling as well. And I like to throw in lots of pictures of cute little babies because they're so cute. Yeah, why not? And that's what it's about. Is that what somebody said? Yeah. Before I get started, I wanted to just really quickly let you know about a couple of the definitions that are in both the report and what I'm going to be talking about today, and why we're using these definitions. I'll start with the why. Again, we use secondary data for our analyses, and the U.S. Department of Labor uses two classifications for early care and education professionals. They use the classification child care worker and preschool teacher. So although we may not have chosen ourselves, we would not have chosen ourselves to break it down this way, we had to rely on that data, and so just kind of wanted to acknowledge that. And the data is slightly different for each, so you'll see us talking about those separately. So again, the first question we were really asking was, what is the role of this sector in Colorado's economy? How important is it? What we looked at here was, as many economists do, were different economic effect types. So direct economic effects, which is really the income for the industry itself. Indirect effects, which is really for suppliers, accountants, lawyers, that sort of thing that the businesses buy from. Induced effects, which are going out one level further, the kind of because these people are spending money and then they go to King Soopers or they go to buy some clothes, that creates more economic effects. And then we'll also talk a little bit about two types of economic effects that you don't normally hear about, which are enabling effects and investment effects, which are really unique to this industry. And I'll talk about those in a second. So what I really want you to take home today is that the early care and education sector in Colorado has a huge impact. It produces over $1.4 billion in the state's economy. So that's those three types of effects that I was talking about: the direct, the indirect, and then the induced. And it generates $619 million in earnings and over 34,000 jobs. This is comparable to K-12 and higher ed's impact, and it's also comparable to like advertising or the recreation industry or food and services. So it's a strong industry in our state. What it also has going for it that's unique that a lot of other sectors don't are these enabling and investment effects. So enabling effects really refers to the fact that when you've got a child 5 and under for this study, parents can't work unless they've got care for their kids. So there's also an enabling effect of the ability of families to be able to work because their kids are in care and education. And so that for this study we determined was $4.4 billion. And the investment effect is really what happens because children are in high quality care. Avoided costs are there over their lifetime, so not having to go through special ed maybe, or the juvenile justice system, and what kinds of effects come to them in terms of higher wages later in life. So the industry is hugely important, more important than we really give it credit for. And yet, it's totally unaffordable for families. If any of you have had children in early care and education, you know what a stretch it is on your budget. A year of quality infant toddler care is more expensive than a year in college. And you don't have 18 years to prep for it, right? And businesses recognize this too, because the early care and education businesses are having to really struggle between their revenues and their expenditures are not meeting. They are pretty darn far apart. And so they're having to do things to make them meet that aren't always going to be best for the kids, for their workers, and we'll talk about that. And And early care and education professionals are making a fraction their counterparts are making in K-12. The child care workers, and again, this is that difference between what we call them, are making just 51% of what their kindergarten counterparts are making, and the preschool teachers are just making 61%. So why is this? What is going on in the early care and education industry itself, in those businesses that make this, this not work very well? So Andrew and I pulled together a model, and I'm mostly going to say Andrew because he's really the brains on this piece. Pulled together a cost model to really look at what's happening in the in businesses themselves in Colorado. We based it on an existing cost model that some very fine researchers, national researchers, had already done. And then we made some tweaks to it by making sure the salaries were updated, making sure that we changed it so that by quality levels they changed a little bit. We tweaked things so that by region they were different based on cost of living, and made some tweaks for ratios. So that's just a little bit of the technical mumbo jumbo behind that. And throughout the report, if you read it, because it's really fun to snuggle up with at night, and I really recommend you do that. Most of the modeling that I'm going to talk about here is based on a single model of a single county that we worked with. We were hopefully making a representative statement, but there are going to be variations based on a lot of factors. And these are the factors that went into the base model. The base model, just so you know, was El Paso County, so medium-sized provider in El Paso. And here's what we found. We found that providers' ability to break even is highly dependent on local reimbursement and tuition rates. And this is, for those of you in this industry, this is not, you're probably just saying, duh, yeah. It's not a huge shock, but it is kind of shocking to see the chart up here. So what you're seeing up here is the three areas that we looked at. We had a base model, but that was El Paso, but we also lost region, which was Denver, and a lower cost region, which was Mesa County. And you can see that their reimbursement rates in particular, although the market rates play a lot into this as well, really make the difference between whether the business can be profitable or not. So the bars that come up above mean that they're breaking even or even making money. The bars that come down below mean that they're losing money. And we also found that providers are having trouble meeting expenses even with the low wages that are being paid to childcare workers and preschool teachers. And that's the red line that you see there. So the bars are showing you the costs, the expenditures, and how much of it is paid by public costs and how much is private pay, parents essentially. And then the costs is the red line, or sorry, the salaries is the red line. If we were to try to raise that to kindergarten, to parity with kindergarten, it's the yellow line. So you can see it makes an even bigger gap between expenses and revenues. What we also found out is that if you're a large provider, you have more choices in terms of being able to make some money. So larger providers, particularly at lower quality levels, are more able to make ends meet than smaller providers at higher quality levels because they have a lot more different kinds of expenses that they're dealing with and not the economies of scale that the large providers have. And unfortunately, and this won't come as a surprise to people either, I'm afraid, is that serving infants and toddlers is really financially infeasible for most providers, which is reflected in the fact that we have a very insufficient amount of infant toddler care all across the state. And it's because providers have to make a choice. Can I stay in business or can I serve infants and toddlers? And they often have to make the choice to stay in business and not serve infants and toddlers, particularly at higher quality levels. We do know that public subsidies can really help improve provider sustainability, especially at high quality levels. So this is showing the brown bars are showing more, the bars to the left are showing more public subsidy and the bars to the right are more private pay. But so what? I mean, this is kind of, we kind of know all of this, right? It's not necessarily new information. The so what is because we have created a system where the failure of the business to really work is being put on the shoulders of the workers. The fact that we can't make those expenses and revenues come together, the only choice that we often have is just to keep the cost low. And the main cost in early care and education is salaries. And so this is where you see the childcare workers and the preschool teachers making just a fraction of what their K-12 workers are making. And what happens then is that we're paying people wages that are poverty level wages. They're not sustainable wages. So the first bar on the left shows you poverty, the poverty level for a family of 4 in El Paso County. And the bar on the far right, no, see, yeah, no, that's right. The bar on the far right shows you the sustainability, self-sufficiency level for an adult and 2 children in El Paso County. And then the bars in the middle are showing you average wages for childcare workers and preschool teachers. So what you're seeing here is that we're not paying people enough to be able to meet the self-sufficient, even self-sufficiency, not even close. And so what does that mean? That means that these workers, unless they have access to, a trust fund or something, are having to find other ways to make ends meet. And one of those ways is going to be public subsidies. So the red box that you see around there are all the public subsidies that a child care worker who's earning that average salary would be eligible for. Whereas the blue box is all the public subsidies that a preschool teacher at that average salary are eligible for. So there's a trickle-down effect to our inability to pay workers at the level that they can actually sustain themselves. It comes back around to society in the form of other subsidies. It also comes back around in terms of the cost of turnover, and that's because teachers leave. On the way over here, as I was stuck on Spear Boulevard, I heard that Target is going to start paying their entry-level workers $15 an hour. So if a teacher has a choice, $15 an hour, $9 an hour. So there's a lot of turnover in this industry. And it has an impact on our kids. It has an impact by lowering quality and by limiting the content. Which brings us to the final question, which is this market working for Colorado? And I think you already know what my answer is going to be based on this study, which is no, it's not working. Families are unable to pay the full cost of the quality of care and education that they want and that society benefits from. On the other hand, society is not picking up the marginal cost between what families can afford and what quality services actually cost. And I am going to turn it over to my friend Diana, who did a fabulous study of the workforce here in Colorado. She'll tell you another side of the story. And then, let's see if I can get you on camera.
That was kind of a bummer, huh? It was kind of a bummer. And as Meg mentioned, I, along with my colleague, Dr. Bean-Wan Lee from the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago, conducted an early childhood workforce survey. And the purpose of this survey was really to identify some of the strengths, gaps, and unmet needs in our workforce. There will be some times during my presentation where there's some shiny moments that we're going to be very excited about. And there's going to be some other times where we're going to feel like, wow, this is a real bummer. So, but what I would like to know from you is by your facial expressions, but is what we found reflective of your experience? So just kind of give me some feedback as we go, because this is our workforce, and this is a survey that I conducted. And for those of you who were part of this survey, you know that it was an extraordinarily long survey that we administered. I mean, I get that all the time. It took me half an hour, 45 minutes to fill out this survey. And we had about 28 research questions in this survey that are drawn from the survey. I had to think about what are the two most important research questions that we could really delve into tonight that I thought you might be interested in the most. So the first was, what are the background characteristics and workplace characteristics of the sample of ECE teachers in Colorado? And what factors predict turnover, retention, occupational burnout, and depression among ECE teachers? Now, again, this was a long survey. There's many more research questions, and we'll point you to about 8 different research briefs that came out of this survey at the end. And also I want to I'll let you know that we also explored some of these same questions with family child care providers. We didn't leave them out, but for tonight, we want to focus on the ECE teachers and center-based programs. So basically what we did for this survey was, it was distributed about 9 months ago. And our primary recruiting mechanism for this early childhood workforce survey was Colorado's Early Childhood Professional Development and Information System, which is by and large Colorado's registry, among other things. So what this means is that the survey and the respondents from the survey, they're not necessarily representative of the overall population of early childhood teachers in Colorado. What they are representative, however, is of people participating in the PDIS. And at the time that we administered this survey, there were about 18,000 early childhood professionals registered in. So 18,000 people, professionals, received this survey. It was also distributed through a number of different professional listservs. So I'm sure a lot of you saw it in your email, and hopefully some of you took it. So what we did was to make sure that it was representative, that the results, the interpretations, our findings were applicable to Colorado. What we did was for those who kind of are interested in this, we weighted our data based on the geography and the position. That means that we weighted it proportionally, so that, that Denver had the population of Denver, Weld County had it of Weld County, and so forth. So we tried to take into consideration geography and position, making sure that we had good representation from different service sectors, from different positions, director, teacher, assistant teacher. So here, tell a little bit about our sample. So basically, our sample included 711 directors who worked in 711 unique licensed early child care centers. And this reflects actually about 35% of the population of licensed centers in Colorado, which I think was an outstanding response rate. Of those centers, now we had to slice and dice and define our terms pretty carefully in this study. And in Colorado, we have what we call a mixed delivery system. So you can be in public Head Start funding, you can be in community-based programs and have Colorado preschool funding and Head Start funding, and it's a smorgasbord out there. However, we had to make some very clear definitions because we couldn't slice and dice the data along all the different possibilities. So what's important to know here is that of the centers, we define community-based centers as those centers who are not receiving any Head Start money and they're not located in public schools. We defined Head Start as receiving Head Start funding, and we redefined public school-based programs as located in the district and located in a public school building. So it's not the optimal way, but it is what we had to make some decisions. So when we talk about these different service sectors, that's what I'm referring to. So we had about 70% of community-based centers respond to the survey. About 16% of the directors worked in Head Start, and about 14% were public school-based. And also it's important to note, of the community-based programs, about 54% were nonprofit, the remainder were for-profit. So that's a pretty good distribution. Yep, it does. It does, absolutely. It is the landscape of early childhood in here, absolutely. And so when we think about our teachers, we had a little over 2,300 lead teachers respond to the survey, and a little over 1,100 assistant teachers respond. And of those, and we've combined them together, we had about 45% of those teachers worked in community-based, 30% in Head Start, and 25% in public school-based. And of those combined teachers, we had about almost 70% who identified themselves primarily as preschool teachers, and the remainder as infant and toddler teachers. So again, this really does kind of hit the landscape of early childhood in Colorado. So here we have a little bit of the characteristics of this sample. So this is kind of our first glimpse into the data. And if we look at the very first column, what we see here are the average ages. And my first glimpse at those average ages were, oh, that's a lot older than I would have expected. But this is where our sampling is important to consider, because we did use the PDIS, and it is quite likely that the people who responded to this survey were working in centers who are part of quality improvement initiatives, who are part of Colorado Shines, or have taken it upon themselves to enroll in the PDIS, and they may have dedicated themselves to this profession. But that doesn't mean they can stay in it, but they have perhaps a certain kind of characteristics. So they tend to be a little bit older. Now, here's the funny part. Percent nearing retirement. I define this as 50 and over. And let's all laugh about the idea of working in early childhood and retiring in our 50s. However, there was a method to my madness. And the method was exactly what Jennifer was talking about, that in about 10 years from now, we are facing a dramatic shortage, between 35 and 45% of early childhood professionals across the state. And in about 10 or 15 years, this group is going to be retiring. So we need to factor that in to who we need to think about recruiting. So that was, I don't really think we're all going to be retiring at 50. But so what this says to me is that we are also approaching a shortage potentially of directors. There's about 40% approaching retirement in the next 10 to 15 years. Then we move on to the years in the field and the years in the job. Now, what these figures say to me, first I was a little surprised at how high they were, and I thought about the sample. But what I also did was I looked at other workforce studies nationally and in other communities that were similar or states similar to Colorado. And these actually are not terribly far off figures from what we're finding elsewhere. And what this shows me is that there's some occupational, there's experience and occupational stability, but there's much less stability in their jobs. So people move around. They can afford to stay, they move around. And we're also seeing about 20% of teachers have been in their jobs for less than that, and directors for less than 2 years. That's kind of a high degree of mobility, and about 38% of assistant teachers. And that's where we continue to see a lot of turnover and movement, which we'll get into in a bit. Here's a shining light. Look at the education. What do you think of that? I mean, we often talk about our workforce being not prepared, but in terms of formal education, we have about 81% of directors in this sample with an AA degree, about 71% of head teachers with an AA degree or higher, and about 49% of assistant teachers. It's a shining light. Yeah. Oh, now that's a good question. Let's figure that out. We can do that. I got it. I'm on it. I would imagine that those figures have certainly gone up. But I don't know off the top of my head. But I think that the important question to ask ourselves here, actually, let me give you a little bit more of a breakdown, because we also need to consider this a little bit more by service sector. Because what we are finding, of course, is that public school-based teachers tend to have higher degrees than community-based teachers. And at the end of the day, let me get my bearings here. 66% of community-based teachers, 74% of Head Start lead teachers, and 80% of public school-based teachers have at least an AA degree. So we do see certainly differences by service sector. And we also know that the lead teachers, when we looked at comparisons, that the lead teachers in community-based programs were more likely to have a high school degree as their highest level of education in community-based programs than in other service sectors. So we definitely still have work to do. But but just given that this high rate of degrees is an important thing to consider. But we also need to consider what the content of that degree is. So we asked teachers, directors, if they had a degree, and what you'll see on the bottom in the percentage, those are, again, just to remind you, the percents in those different job roles that have at least an AA degree or higher, that we asked them if they had a degree related to young children, and we were pretty broad in scope. We included early childhood special education, child development, human development and family relations, and family studies. So we tried to be pretty inclusive, whether the degree was focused on supporting children and family development. And the important thing on this slide is the bottom bar. And what we see here is about 48% of lead teachers and directors do not have a degree focused on young children, any degree, and 84% of assistant teachers. But what this means to me, though, is that we really in higher education needs to start thinking about diverse pathways, educational pathways for where people actually are. So we need to think about seamless course transfer for AA to BA, most certainly. And I think we all agree on that. But what we also have is, at least in this sample, and this is a sample of teachers and directors that are really involved, career or educational pathways that are appropriate for them. Not sending them back to the AA degree for 101 and 102 if they have a BA or an MA. Appropriate for where they are. That's my soapbox. I own it. So, but that's what I make of this. Now, let's talk a little bit about the race and ethnicity of the sample of providers, of teachers and directors in this program, or in this survey. So what we see here is that a sizable portion of our at least in this sample, the early educator workforce in this sample, are white Caucasian. And what we also need to think about here is kind of the hierarchy of career trajectories in an ECE center. So we think about assistant teacher, then lead teacher, all the way up to program administrator. And we see that the diversity of the workforce, or at least in this sample, starts to decrease as they make it up the ladder. And when we actually compare these figures, we see that in the assistant teachers, it is pretty reflective of the population of children and families in Colorado. But as we move up, the diversity decreases. And when we compared, what we found was Latina teachers in particular in assistant teacher roles than they were in head and program administrator roles. So when we think about recruitment and development of our teachers, we really need to be thinking about our assistant teachers and our Latina assistant teachers and developing them and moving them up along a career trajectory. We'll also talk a little bit more about the languages. So the language, we asked teachers, what languages they spoke, and then some of the languages of the children in their classroom that they spoke. And what we found was this is very similar to public school. About 78% of teachers work in classrooms, 78% of teachers work in classrooms in which at least one child speaks a language other than English. And about 51% of those teachers also noted that they didn't speak the same language of all the children in their classrooms. And so the most frequent mismatch occurred when there was an English-speaking teacher and Spanish-speaking children, and there was not a Spanish-speaking teacher in the classroom. So again, it's really coming at, we need to start thinking about developing our Spanish-speaking Latina teachers. And then to a lesser extent, the mismatches in language occurred that we might need to think about recruiting around Mandarin, Vietnamese, and Arabic. Okay, let's center ourselves because we're about to go to wages. Ready? Okay. So, this is the average, so this is across service sectors. This is taking everybody and putting it into the mix. And so what we find is that the average hourly wage across service sectors for directors was a little over $20 an hour. For lead teachers, a little under $15 an hour, remember target. And for assistant teachers was about $12 an hour. So let's get a little more nuance. So the other thing I wanted to point out is that we did look at differences in wages based on the race and ethnicity of teachers, and we did not find differences based on race and ethnicity. But now we'll get into where we did find some differences, and sadly where we also didn't. So this slide is simply lead teachers, okay? So what we did, the first 3 bars there represent service sectors. So in national studies, now statistically, we found there is a difference between community-based programs and the pay of public school-based teachers. There was a statistically significant difference. However, the magnitude of that difference is quite small. So when we look at other workforce surveys across the country, we actually see a much wider gap between community-based teachers and public school-based teachers. And my interpretation of this kind of flatter wages across the service sectors is that in a number of districts are not required to pay preschool teachers at elementary school wages. So that's something that's going on in Colorado. I guess the good news is there wasn't a big difference between infant and toddler and preschool teachers. In national surveys, what we find is there's about a $9,000 pay gap between infant toddler teachers and preschool teachers, but in this survey, we found it was almost about a $2,000 gap. Statistically significant, but again, the magnitude is pretty small. And here's where my heart sinks a little bit. Look at the difference between a teacher who has a high school diploma as her highest level of education and a teacher that has a BA. That difference is $3.07 an hour. There's not a lot of incentive built in our system to gain more education. And by and large, this is pretty flat. It seems like Colorado is kind of tried to get the bottom up, but it's created, in some ways, the flatness is good, right? Because there's some equity, but in other ways, there's no incentive, and it's still really low. So let's talk a little bit about the economic fragility and how people are feeling about this. So what we did was we administered an economic strain or financial strain scale, and this is just one little glimpse into it. But basically what we're finding here is because of those low wages, there's about 43% of the sample of teachers, which includes lead and assistants, that have big difficulties meeting their bills at the end of each month and making ends meet. And as in addition, only 40% of, this is community-based teachers. We're assuming that a lot of the Head Start teachers and the public school-based teachers receive a benefits package. So the most important teachers to look at in this analysis are the community-based teachers, because they're less likely to receive a benefits package. So we're thinking about 40% do not receive health insurance. About 26% receive retirement, which again makes it a little laughable that we're all retiring at 50. And then 66% paid vacation, 51% paid sick. What this means is that about 32% of the teachers, both assistants and head teachers combined in this study, receive some sort of public subsidy because of their low incomes. And that could be housing subsidies, that could be WIC food stamps, that could be free and reduced lunches for children, could be Medicaid, a whole host of things. And about a quarter of the teachers sampled have to take a second job to make ends meet. Sobering, and you know this. And this obviously has an impact on turnover. So what we did was we asked directors to report on the turnover in their programs. And what we found was that across service sectors, there's an annual 18% turnover rate among program leaders. This is across service sectors, that's not up here. And about a 16% turnover in lead teachers and a 22% turnover in assistant teachers. And I pulled out a special subgroup of teachers in a thankless job called floaters. And floaters, as if you don't know, are the ones who move around from classroom to classroom to support a teacher who might need it, or if there's a vacation or a sick day, floaters, on average. And if we were to look at it in a statistically significant differences, what we find is that Head Start centers are experiencing significantly more turnover in program leaders than public schools. What we're also finding is that community-based programs experience higher turnover in lead teachers compared to public schools, and that community-based and Head Start centers experience higher turnover in assistant teachers compared to public schools. And floaters, poor floaters. That Head Start and community-based programs much higher turnover rates. So what we wanted to do was really look at what is it that predicts turnover, what is it that predicts retention of what we're calling qualified teachers in the field. And by qualified, we define that as teachers with an AA degree in ECE or higher, their intentions to stay in their jobs, and their well-being. And we looked at two dimensions of their well-being. We looked at their burnout, their occupational burnout, and we looked at their depression rates. And list of factors. Again, if you took the survey, 85 pages long, we looked at a lot. So at the policy level, ecology of a child care program or ACE program. The policy level, we looked at the number of funding sources in a program. We looked at whether they participated in Colorado Shines. We looked at a program level, basically the length of their year. We looked at their director education level. And we also asked teachers about their perceptions of the quality of their work environment around leadership, around collegiality, around a number of factors. We looked at their, what else did we look at? We looked at subsidy density, children who are receiving subsidies in the program or in the classroom. We looked at challenging the teachers' perceptions of the number of children of challenging behaviors. We looked at the turnover rates in their classroom. We looked at ratios. We also looked at the teacher level, at their own education level, at their primary job frustrations. We asked about a suite of job frustrations and motivations that I should have put in here to stay in their job. The wages, the number of benefits, hours worked per week, like it was a kitchen sink of looking at different things. What we found, and this is kind of the culminating piece, is if we just think about turnover and retention and like wanting to stay in the job or not, take those first separately. What we found in that whole suite was that the only factor to predict turnover was wages, such that higher wages predicted less turnover. The only factor to predict retention of the qualified teachers was working on a 9-month calendar year. And this included, it wasn't just, this isn't just public school-based teachers. This is everybody factored in here. So it's not that the public school teachers are pulling this, driving this solely. It's that people need time to recuperate and rejuvenate. That's to be able to stay in their jobs. And the factors that predicted people's intentions to stay in their jobs were, again, higher wages, more benefits, and then leadership. And namely, it was leadership that was collaborative in nature, and that was fostering a degree of collegiality among teachers. Now, that's kind of like the retention and turnover, but then we have to think about the self and the well-being of teachers. And those had slightly different constellation of factors that predicted the well-being. So I think about this in terms of what are the main ingredients that create risk for teachers in terms of their well-being, and then what are some of the things, the factors that protect them or buffer them from those risks. So what we see here, and I'm giving you kind of a gestalt of it, is that in general, kind of the risks to well-being are really around excessive paperwork and having multiple program standards and high ratios in the classroom. So multiple quality improvement, multiple, like what we do to ensure that ECE is available to children and accessible to children, and blending the funding and doing all those things to make it possible is also draining on our, it is creating a burnout among our teachers. Those accountability mechanisms to ensure that they're creating burnout. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but I'm saying we need to be careful. And what really seems to be buffering is the director and leadership. So the education level of the directors, their leadership style, particularly having a collaborative leadership style, and their collegiality. And those kind of cut across to some extent the burnout and the depression dimensions. So I'm being told I have to get off now. So I tend to not leave things dangling without like lots of recommendations and ideas, but that's not my, that is our esteemed panel's job tonight. So with the findings. So thank you.
Okay, we actually have not one but two times allotted for questions. So right now, 10 minutes with any methodological questions for Megan, Diana, any specifics about the results? And we'll just start right in. Lisa.
Great job, guys. Thank you. I had a question about the 9-month work year. Did you check to see if any of the teachers, assistant teachers, or directors had you? Why some people do get into this field so they can take care of their own children with their own schedules?
Yes. What we did was factor in a roundabout way. I wouldn't say it was as direct. What we did was we asked about job motivations and job frustrations. And some of it, the job frustrations were around kind of the work-life balance or schedules around their own children. And so we factored that into the frustrations part.
Other questions for our researchers? Great.
This is a follow-up, actually. I was curious if you looked at any of these factors for infant toddler teachers versus preschool, especially the 9-month, because there aren't many infant toddler programs that only run for 9 months.
We haven't, and that makes me remember I needed to say something methodologically, and that was, I mentioned that we started off with a sample of about 711 unique centers, and what we did to be able to do that last analysis was we were able to match teachers within programs. So if a director answered a survey and a teacher, or at least one teacher answered a survey, we were able to do write some programming to match the two and do kind of, and so that reduced our sample to about 366. And so if we sliced it to the infants and toddlers, I'm not 100% sure that we would have enough power to see that. But we'll look at that.
Okay. I think I saw another one. Yep.
Thank you both. They were both great presentations, and I have a question for both of you, and it has to do with how things look in rural Colorado in comparison to urban and suburban Colorado.
Sure. We looked, we used Mesa as our rural area, and they were struggling a lot more than their more, and it has a lot to do with just what the wages are out there, in general, and that sort of thing. But across all of our modeling and analyses, we found that they were having a much harder time making ends meet than, but that has a lot to do with reimbursement rates. Which as many of you probably know, for CCAP anyhow, are locally controlled. And so there's a lot that I'll let this panel talk about in terms of what can possibly be done in that area.
So we're taking the data right now, and we are going around the state, talking in different regions and combining some of the data regionally. And I would say that we can't do that, the inferential statistics at the end where we're talking about what predicts at kind of the regional level. We just don't have the sample size. But our data reflects exactly what Meg is saying, that along the western slope there's more struggles. But what we were really, but I don't want to go fully to say that, because we also were just in the resort region, and so their data looks better, but their cost of living is dramatically higher. So is it really better? I don't think so. No one's doing well.
Anyone else? Oh, one more.
My question, and I'm not really sure which person alluded to it earlier, about a projection for us having a future crisis with our early childhood workforce. And I guess my challenge is I think we already are there. Mm-hmm. This is going to be a worse crisis, but I feel like we're in crisis now.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah, great point. And in fact, I think there's some community engagements going on right now, Diana alluded to, and loud and clear we're hearing from the first 2 site visits this absolutely is the worst that it has ever been. We've got nowhere to go but down, apparently, until we hear from our respondents who are going to offer a lot of solutions, right? Anything else? Okay, and I think both researchers have agreed to stay after if there's some more specific questions. Right now, join me in thanking them. Okay. And I'd like to invite our panelists up. So we're moving from research into action, from a bit of doom and gloom, hopefully into some possibility of change that we can make. And we have a really great panel here that represents three very, very different perspectives. So I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Rebecca Cantor. She is Dean here at CU Denver of the School of Education and Human Development. Nancy Linville, Director of the Office of Early Learning at the Colorado Department of Education, and Bill Jager, who is Vice President of Early Childhood Initiatives at the Colorado Children's Campaign. And I'm going to start you off with the same question. And then after we get some initial responses, we really want to hear from you, and they would really like to engage with you for the rest of the session. So here's the big question. It's a two-parter, which is based on where you sit. You've heard all this data, you've been out there, you have different experiences either with the workforce, with policy, with programs. What is the one takeaway you want this group to hang on to from where you sit that you feel could inspire some action? And then what do you think that action is that really needs to happen? And I'll go ahead and sit down.
Yeah, I organized some thoughts. I'm not sure it aligns completely with that question, but I'll try to get to that alignment. But you know, I have to warn you, you have started with the ultimate optimist and the relentless Pollyanna and the person who refuses to quit and refuses to lie down. I've been at this since 1975 when I graduated from college and began teaching mostly in early childhood, some in early elementary. Is this on? Can you hear me in the back? Yeah. Okay. But here's, to me, it is difficult news, and it could be depressing to look at what was up on the screen. On the other hand, we've never had a more compelling argument and a more compelling set of realities, evidence. I believe in evidence. I believe in documentation. We've never had that before. Across several buckets of compelling evidence for making the argument for what we know we need and want. So tonight we heard the economic analysis that Meg presented is outstanding. Billions and billions and billions of dollars that we affect in many, many ways in our local, but we could take it to any state in the nation if we wanted to, but keeping here in Colorado, billions of dollars that we affect in this state is a very compelling piece of evidence. If we pulled the plug on this industry, look how much would swirl down the drain and go away. That's huge. That really argues for our industry writ large. That's the first thing to know. We count, we matter, and everything would, if we pulled the plug, it would go away. Add that together with the incredible, compelling work we have in neuroscience. We have always known, since I started this work in the mid-70s, we always knew how important these developmental periods are. We have always believed in the impact of our work, but we never had the evidence. Policy shifts with evidence. Policy doesn't listen to our experience and our wise, clinically informed opinion. It just doesn't. We have the evidence in that bucket as well. We've never had that. We have, so if you put those two together, the economic analysis, the deep look that Diana shared is much more detailed and much more compelling than knowing that we're way behind, knowing that we're struggling and and how difficult it is to watch that for any of us. This look is really detailed. The fact that yes, people have bachelors, but they're not in our field. I'm going to get back to that in a sec. Come back to that in a second. That's really important detail to put out there in this compelling argument we're going to make together. The fact that there isn't incentive, we've brought the bottom down, but we flattened the top, so now there's less incentive by those numbers to go for another degree. I want to come back to that as well. The look across some of the assumptions we were making about who's doing a little bit better than other sectors. We have a very fragmented, very complex field. So just having general statements about the workforce and the salary situation we have is not as helpful as having this kind of deeper look. So I think it's fantastic work, and I think it adds, when we add it, that very deep look that was just presented, to the compelling work we have in neuroscience, to the economic impact that we represent as an industry. That is new, that's different, that positions us differently. Add to it the incredible work that my good colleague Nancy Linville led, and many of you and many of us participated in, to create PDIS, to create the infrastructure. That's new, we haven't had that before. We're ready. Not only can we demonstrate the state we're in, but we can show the policymakers, the funders, the taxpayers, and everybody else who needs to come together with will to make this picture look different. We can show we're really ready. We have the supports in place to support the action we want to take. That's different. So we're ready, and I've always believed that that has to come first. That when we capture the will and the attention of the public, and they turn around and they look at us, we can't be not ready. We can't then say, well, wait a minute, let us get ready, and we'll be able to charge ahead. We have to be ready first, and we really are ready. Quality rating systems and so forth. We have many, many pieces in place. So solutions. The fact that the BA is not in early childhood, I'm still kind of amazed that we pulled this off. I was teasing. We did. I was teasing Bill the other day. Oh, it's easy to make bills and get them passed. Let's do that again. But of course, it's not. We were intentional and purposeful and had the right supports. But it is now possible for the early childhood workforce from any sector, community child care, public school, Head Start, to sign on for an alternative licensure quick entry program. How many people know what those are? Because I won't launch into a definition. So there are lots of them. We have one here, but there are many others in the around the state. They are exactly for people who hold a BA in another field. But the original alternative licensure law was written only for public schools. So we went forward and created momentum, and it amazingly passed, to allow community early childhood folks from any sector, someone holding a BA can sign on for an alternative licensure. It generally, it's much less expensive. It's usually a year of, you have to be working. It's not possible to go through alternative licensure without working. You sign on for a program and get a year's worth of coaching, support, content, and so forth. And at the end of that year, you have eligibility to get an early childhood license from the Colorado Department of Education. So seeing that, I really think that was an important move that we made, and I think it's a good one. And I invite you to explore the alternative licensure programs. Ours is called Aspire. Does DU have one? I think DTR, Metro has one. There are lots in the state. The other thing is that PDIS was structured. The other thing that I think is a really important solution is to both create inclusiveness, which the PDIS really intended to create. The way that you make progress in the PDIS is inclusive of folks who have degrees, as the degree that they want, work experience, professional development, and the ability to demonstrate competency. So we try to be very inclusive about how can you demonstrate and how can you fit into this new structure. But to me, the next challenge is to work across those columns in the rows. So almost done. So last point, we're trying to figure out how to use some of the really exciting new developments in higher education, like micro-credentialing, which would take a 3-credit course, break it into 3 1-credit units that you might earn through professional development, or you might earn through academic credit, but create easy pathways, supported pathways, not easy, but supported pathways from that professional development into chunks of academic credit that can be stacked to a course. Recognizing that as a teacher in the fall, you might have enough time in your life and enough energy to take a 1-credit module. And it might be next spring before you can have that again, and then next summer we have that again, but by the summer you have a course. So you're not just running in place all the time, taking training that doesn't take you down the path. Because again, I believe that the bachelor's degree and the associate's degree will become more important in this picture. But when it does, you want to be holding one. You don't want to be starting. So I'm going to pause there and just say, I think as hard as this picture is, I think we have lots to feel ready with and prepared with and good about. So, Nancy.
Well, thank you for being such the optimist. So I think many of us up here actually are optimists, but the picture that was painted is really one of the most sobering starting points for many, many years. It is the worst case that we've been in the early learning industry ever. But I also think that what we do know is that early learning counts. As Rebecca said, early learning matters. And I think what's really important in changing within the P12 system is that our partners in P12 understand the foundation for our P12 system. And what's really been recently exciting at the Colorado Department of Education is that we are working on our next version of our performance plan. And until this year, I would say it's always been the K-12 performance plan. So we'll see if this holds, but a sneak peek is it's the P-12 performance plan. And I don't think that's just a simple statement to make. What that shows is that the influence of early learning at the Colorado Department of Education has grown over time. And really most significantly in our past 4 to 5 years, I'd say one big influence has been this notion of preschool to 3rd grade, or P3. And while a lot of us in our field, we've been saying that forever, the science of child growth and development is birth through age 8, really our partnerships with our community schools and our district preschools has not always been as strong. So we are learning at the Colorado Department of Ed. We're learning from other districts across the state that gives us, we have a DPS birth through a roadmap. We have Boulder Valley. We have Aurora Public Schools. We have schools across the state, northeast, southeast, every corner of the state, thinking about and growing P3. So I think a big acknowledgement at the Department of Education is that we ourselves are responding to this. So there's going to be a new office at the Colorado Department of Education. It's not going to be early learning or literacy or this or that. It's actually going to be the preschool to 3rd grade office. So that's a big step forward. We're going to lead the way. We're going to bring districts forward. We have strong partners, one right in front of me, Education Commission of the States, Bruce Atchison is here, providing technical assistance to us. So what does this mean? It means we're going to bring together Colorado Preschool Program, Results Matter, Preschool Special Education, READ Act, Literacy, Early Childhood Workforce Development, School Readiness, all into one office. So we will be working differently together. We will be leveraging our resources. And again, I think this leads the way. We're learning from others across the country. We're also learning from our school and district partners in our state. So that's a good news piece. And this information that we were shown tonight, that we shared tonight, while sobering, We're also going to be sharing it with our state legislators. So another piece of legislation this session, while we didn't get any big increase in funding for early learning, we did, there was an initiative, or it's called Senate Bill 1003, the Educator Shortage Act or report. And so between the Colorado Department of Higher Education and the Colorado Department of Ed, we owe the state legislature a report by December 1 talking about how we are going to solve the strategies for the educator shortage around the state. While the impact in K-12 is much greater within the rural areas, we will be then integrating everything that we have learned, everything that we want to propose as strategies from the P3 system into that report. So that's big. Another big step forward is this is House Bill 103. And so what that did was require all of our low-performing schools in Colorado to actually start using an early learning needs assessment. So we need to work together. We need to partner differently with our early learning settings, our early learning community. And this initiative really lays this out well. We will be having an early learning needs assessment, action plan, and resources to back that up. But it doesn't just stop there, because if you took a look at the 103, it's pretty narrowly defined. We can't ask everything at once from our lowest performing schools. At the same time, with our work within Race to the Top and the Early Learning Challenge Fund, we were already on this pathway. We have a wonderful early learning needs assessment that now, with the support of 103, it's going to go across lots of initiatives, lots of programs at the Colorado Department of Education. So we'll be using it obviously in the new office preschool to third grade, but ESSA in our federal programs unit will be using this. It will be used across our accountability and low performing schools. And then our Office of Learning Supports will continue forward with the P3 initiative and working with districts and schools across the state, with a big focus on working with principals and increasing their skills and knowledge about early learning. So those are some really good news pieces. And that's why having this information, as Rebecca, I can't say enough, as we started this, we knew the picture wasn't great. We did know that. But until we had the professional development information system, before we had some of this information from a statewide picture, we only had bits and pieces. And for those of you who have worked in front of the state legislature or in front of statewide groups, while local stories are so very important, the statewide picture really does need to be shared. And people are going to stand up and take notice. Oh, okay.
We do have time for questions.
Great, thanks. Just first, thanks for inviting us to be part of the panel. I feel like sometimes you're invited on panels because people want to know what you think. This is an instance where they want to know what you're going to do. And that's what the Children's Campaign is about. And also an appreciation to Jennifer and Diana and Meg and Andrew, Gary Community Investments, the Veal Foundation, who really pulled the fire alarm around childcare workforce challenges and the need for us to do something about it. And to your question of what the takeaway is, I think for us, we continue to look at childcare through three lenses: access, affordability, and quality. And so when we talk about access, there's a lot of interest right now in what are we going to do about childcare deserts? What are we going to do about infant and toddler waitlist? Or affordability, what are the statistics around comparisons to college tuition, or how much parents are paying as a percentage of their income, particularly if they're facing some of the challenges of poverty or growing up in single-family households, and then quality. And we've come to the linchpin of quality. So if we're going to make an advance around recruitment, retention, compensation, we have to ask ourselves if we're okay with making a substantial public investment to improve the quality and potentially not move forward access and affordability. And that's a challenge. And that's not a false choice. When we go to the legislature and say, We want to do something significant to support the early childhood workforce. It's a choice over public dollars oftentimes. And so I think what you've drawn our attention to and what this research says is if we are serious about addressing this workforce issue, we have to get some degree of comfort with saying we are up for a significant investment in our workforce, and it might mean that we don't move forward access and affordability at the same time. In the ideal world, we move all those things forward, but I want us to consider as a community and express my appreciation that we're willing to drive that conversation and saying that we need to be about quality. The linchpin of quality is our workforce, and we need a public investment commensurate with that. I think the second thing I would sort of highlight as a takeaway from this is, in a similar vein, we need to talk about both demand side solutions from a public policy standpoint. How do we help more parents afford childcare, put more dollars in the pockets of families to be able to afford the quality that they need? But we also need to talk about supply side solutions. How do we make sure people can go into this business, that they can open up childcare classrooms, and that they can pay people an adequate salary to be in this business? And quite often, and it's true across the advocacy sector, we have been much more focused on the demand side solutions. How do we make sure people afford childcare? And we have to start thinking of those policy solutions. I do think that the report does a very good job of laying out what some of those supply side solutions might be. Early educator tax credit, a strategy around direct investment to support compensation, an approach that says the providers themselves need to be appropriately compensated and appropriately supported in providing something that has such a widespread societal benefit. So the opportunity to advance supply side solutions alongside demand side ones is a major takeaway from this work. And finally, to conclude, I would say that public policy matters. You all are sacrificing a dinner at home, time with your family, a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old and a wife who are letting me be here tonight. You all probably have similar circumstances. And so the question becomes, if you are willing to make that sacrifice to come here, very academic presentation with a lot of statistics and graphs, and some folks reflect on what that means, are you also willing to give up a lunch hour to come to the legislature and testify? To give up an evening making phone calls to state policymakers? Because a lot of those same conversations, the same public resources we're fighting for at the legislature with state policy, folks are willing to make that sacrifice. And is the early childhood community willing to do that as well? You heard wonderful public policy reflections around advancements we've continued to make, whether it be Senate Bill 103 that gives us a P3 focus, whether it be alternative licensure strategies, all wins in the last legislative session. Legislators are listening. We've gone in our child care subsidy program, CCAP, $13 million in state general fund going to support that program in 2013 to $26 million in 2017. That's a doubling of our investment in our child care subsidy program. We can make that change happen, but it's a collective action and collective responsibility. So if you're willing to join in that effort, the Children's Campaign is ready to stand with you. So,
that was fantastic. That's like best group of respondents I've ever heard. Maybe because you said what I wanted you to say, but no, really great. We have a little bit of time for questions for this great set of respondents. So please raise your hand and we'll get those questions answered.
I have a similar experience to Rebecca, starting back in the days when the earth was still cooling. It's interesting to ponder early childhood education, which has now shifted from the notion that it's just daycare to actually early childhood education. So part of our challenge, and it was in the 70s and all the way through, is how do you make the pre-K, pre-3 a connection to real school? Because there's this notion that, oh, those are just little kids, we don't worry about them. And we all know that all the tremendous growth that's occurring in the young child before he or she arrives at school. So what are your thoughts about making that connection so that it does become a P20 experience?
Nancy, do you want to?
Yeah, I do. I think we have some really strong programs that are already doing that. One would be the Results Matter program. And so that's a program that with our Colorado preschool program, Head Start, in fact, in our state, there are 48,000 of our 4-year-olds participating in Results Matter. And our teachers in our classrooms, whether they're community settings, public preschool, are really using observational assessment to think about where children are and putting together learning plans and helping children move forward. And so that really mirrors what K-12 is typically doing. So we are using child outcomes and assessment. We are using measures of how we, in classrooms as educators, are changing our practice. So those same observational tools. So the Colorado Shines Quality Rating and Improvement System has measures of observation that are probably stronger than sometimes we see in our K-12 settings, where it's very much focused on individual educators. And at the same time, many settings are also using individual education or observation of educators to show how well we're doing in classrooms. So I think there are lots of practices that we're seeing. And I also think with the Race to the Top and the work Rebecca referenced around the professional development information system, we have fully embraced competencies of thinking about our skills and practices in the birth through age 8 world as professionals, whether we're educators, whether we're directors and leaders, and acknowledging where we are, what we need to learn to improve our practice. So I think we have lots of very strong examples.
Thank you. Sure.
Something we all can do, and it's not an ask, I'm going to acknowledge that, is to promote and to support and promote the idea of the P20 continuum, which means that we're going to have to yield a bit on our boundaries. I'm not suggesting we don't lose something by becoming part of P20 in the publicly funded schooling system. We will. We'll gain things and we'll lose some things. But at this point in time, I believe we have more to gain. But if we hang on to the neighborhood, the fragmented neighborhoods we've created, we didn't create them. There were lots of reasons why they're there, but we are hanging on to them. So we have, you know what they are. There are many different neighborhoods. They all have different funding streams. They have different policy and regulation structure and so forth and so on. It's going to take a lot of work to streamline them into a publicly funded P20 system. But if we resist that as the professional community, it'll take that much longer. And I personally think that we'll have more to gain by being part of that. If the conversation over here is K-12 or even P-12, and people see the rest of early care and education as after we fund this, we'll get to that. We're going to be retired, all of us, and long gone before we see the funding come to us, the rest of it. It's so easy. We are making forced choices. But if we're inside the P20 system, if that's where people see us, then they have to include us in the solution and in the decision. So I've been arguing for and promoting early care and education being part of having a framework that brings us together, includes us together for a long time. Important, and that there's more to gain than to lose.
Bill, anything you'd like to add?
I think it's the exact right question. If we can change the conversation to be more about where are children learning, they're learning wherever they are. And therefore, when we begin to think about early education, early care and education as part of the continuum, you have then an obligation to think less about early care and education as a private good and more of a public good. And with that comes the commensurate investment in public policy support.
It's fantastic. And with that, please join me in thanking our respondents and our researchers. You can find all the reports here at this website. And again, I think folks will stay around if you have more questions or comments. Thank you so much for coming.
Before you leave, please help yourself to some more fellowship and